Uh, Thank you, Andrea. Very quickly, this meeting is being recorded. The chat will only be used for attendance or technical assistance. If you are not a member of the committee, please take this time to put your name and affiliation, if it's applicable, in the chat. Please remain muted unless I ask you to speak. We will be having one presentation today by NYCHA. We'll first recognize committee members, and then if there is time, we will recognize other attendees. In order to be recognized, please raise your hand. You can do that by clicking the raise hand button on the bottom of Zoom, or I think there's a new feature where if you raise your hand for long enough, it actually raises your Zoom hand, which is pretty cool. And last thing, there was an item on this agenda which we have had to bump to next week. Translator or interpreters, would you mind just interpreting this one to the applicable channels if relevant? The item on the 88 East Broadway Mall has been moved to the February meeting of land use. We'll not be hearing that today. And so we thank anyone who is here for that meeting for their understanding. And we will see you next month. I believe that is all that we need the interpreters to stay on for. Kyle, Susan, is that right?
Well, I'm just a little worried since we don't have a sign that people are going to still be getting on. Maybe have them stay on for like 15 minutes and just take a break then to do that.
Sure, let's do that. Is that okay with all of you? Fantastic. Thanks so much. All right. First things first, Megan, can you call attendance, please?
Sure. Jake Gold,
Present.
Alistair Economakis,
Yes.
Andrea Gordillo,
Yes.
Herman Hewitt.
Yes.
Thank you. Trevor Holland,
Present.
Damaris Reyes. Damaris. Sandra Struther,
Yes.
Jackie Wong. Jackie. Dominic Berg. Dominic.
He's going to be late.
Ariana Chua, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Can you help me with the
No, that's
pronunciation?
correct. That's correct. Thanks. I'm
Oh,
here.
good. Great. Steve Herrick
Present.
and Megan Joy present.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan. And really briefly before we get to NYCHA, I just wanted to say hello to everyone. I don't think that I've officially met most of you. This is my first meeting as land use chair. It is a pleasure to be working with everyone, and I intend to give everyone a call sometime in the next 2 weeks or so, just to say hi, check in, and talk about the committee, and also you all. It's great to get to know everyone. So with that said, let's move on to the, first, any objection to the minutes from last month? Without objection, we'll approve the minutes, and now we can move on to the main event.
I would abstain. I wasn't there last.
All right, thank you, Herman. So we'll now move on to the main event that I know y'all have been waiting for. NYCHA is going to give an informational presentation about the NYCHA Public Housing Preservation Trust. Does everyone who needs screen sharing permission have it?
I think so. Courtney, I think I just got it. So let me just, let me test this out. Is that showing up for everyone?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. Great. All right. Well, Jake, thanks so much. Can we take it away? Are we all set? Wonderful.
Yes, please go ahead.
Cool. So maybe we can just start with introducing ourselves. I know many of you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Kaplan. I am the Chief of Staff at NYCHA, and I'm joined by my colleague, Courtney. Courtney, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Kind of opposite of Andrew. I don't think I know many of you, but happy to be here and talk about the trust. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Courtney. So what we'll be spending the next, and we'll be splitting the presentation. I'll talk about the first part and Courtney will go through the second part. What we'll be walking through is very similar information to what has been shared in some of the public meetings that happened at the end of last year in November. And just around that time. So for those of you who attended one of those meetings, there were some that were in person, some that were virtual. Some of this information will be familiar. And might even be duplicative because much of it is the same. And what we'll cover is two parts. One is just a brief background on the Public Housing Preservation Trust, which many of you may be aware of. Nothing particularly new there, but just giving some background information on what the trust is and what it does. And then the second half is going over the final voting procedures for the trust, which were finalized in December of last year, and talking through the procedures themselves that actually have been published on our website and are available. We can copy the link of the exact language of them for those of you who would like to take a look at the exact wording. We'll just give an overview of them. So without further ado, let me just start with something that I'm sure is very familiar to this community board. I know many of you are extremely, either NYCHA residents yourselves or extremely familiar with NYCHA issues. So these figures are likely not to be new to you. What we're showing here is, truly just an incredible disinvestment in public housing and a massive capital need that NYCHA faces across the entire city. And these are, needs that, are falling into a number of different categories that affect building conditions. On the left, where it says the $40 billion, which is the number that NYCHA usually talks about as the overall capital needs of the developments across the city, that falls into things like mold at $15.1 billion. And really, when we talk about mold, we're talking about plumbing, we're talking about piping, we're talking about facades, roof work, things that affect moisture and contribute to, the root causes of mold that are really important for us to be addressing. It also covers lead abatement. It covers heating systems, so the boilers, the distribution lines in the buildings and behind the walls, elevator systems, anything related to pest and waste management, right? So that's like compactor systems. And then the other capital needs of the developments, safety and security, front door access and lobbies, grounds, and so on. And so, those are massive capital needs, but one thing that's really important to note, and I think that this is particularly important to note as we think about what does the 21st century building look like, right? Like how do you bring buildings up to not only up to good condition, but also invest in them into the future. It's also things like electrification, decarbonization, and cladding of buildings and additional weatherization as well to prepare for future weather events. And those are the figures that are shown on the right side of this chart, right? So across the portfolio, there's a need of an estimated additional 9.5 billion or so. And those really are related to what would we want to do if we wanted to make these buildings as resilient, as sustainable as possible going into the future. But again, and this, is nothing new that many of you have probably heard either, or, representatives of NYCHA or, folks in the community talk about this, is the lack of funding. And that is a massive issue that we face, but I do want to acknowledge that it's not the only challenge that NYCHA faces. NYCHA has also had a history of poor management and bad decision making and lack of compliance, which have resulted in settlement agreements, particularly the HUD agreement signed in 2019, which has led to a federal monitor and to a lot of changes in terms of the organization itself. So there's a lot of work for NYCHA to do in terms of fixing our own management, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that at the same time as the funding issues that we face. But the funding issues are critical because they contribute to the capital needs that we were just talking about on that first slide. And so as a bit of background, just to talk about the way that public housing is funded, this slide on the left talks about the way that public housing is currently funded, Section 9. So Section 9, which the federal government allocates each and every year, and it's actually tied to Section 9 of the 1937 Housing Act, is the way that public housing has been funded since its inception. And Congress will appropriate Section 9 every year, and then based on a formula, each housing authority will get a portion of that funding for operations and for not just operations, but capital funding as well, right? So all of the funding that we were just talking about for those long-term investments. That's the traditional way that public housing has been funded, and actually the way that NYCHA developments are currently funded right now. And then on the right is Section 8. And normally, I can't really do this on Zoom. Normally, when I talk about these programs, I ask folks if they've heard of these programs, but it's a little bit harder over Zooms. But many of you may have heard of Section 8 before, or be familiar with someone who either lives in a building with the help of a Section 8 voucher. And the most common type of Section 8 is a tenant-based Section 8 voucher, and tenant-based Section 8 is where you have a voucher that you are able to use on the private market. It will pay for topping up your rent, so the difference between 30% of your income and the rent of an apartment, and it's portable, so it goes around with you depending on the apartment that you are in, and that is the by far and away the most common form of Section 8, not just in New York City, but across the country as well. But there's a second type of Section 8, which is called project-based Section 8. And that Section 8 is the same level of funding. It's the same type of funding appropriated by the federal government, but is actually tied to the apartment and to the building itself. So it's not portable in the same way as a household voucher, a tenant-based voucher is. So what that means is that if there's project-based funding associated with a building, and you as a family move or leave for whatever reason, that funding is staying with the building. It's tied in and actually kind of looks very similar in terms of the year-over-year funding structure to the way that NYCHA's buildings are currently funded. So the reason that we're bringing up Section 8 and talking about it is because there's been a trend over the past 10, 15 years or so nationally, and pushed by the federal government, frankly started by Obama really, to have housing authorities switch funding of public housing developments from Section 9 funding to project-based Section 8 funding. That has been implemented through nationally a program known as the RAD program, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. And in New York City, we call it PACT program. And that program involves I'm getting a bit of an echo. Sorry.
Actually, Andrew, I'm sorry to hijack here. Could
Yes.
I just interrupt briefly and ask the translators to just repeat one more time that the presentation on 88 East Broadway has been bumped to February, and so we will see anyone who is here for that meeting next month. and then they can now log off. I think it's been sufficient time. Thank you all for your hard work, and we'll see you next month. Sorry to hijack.
No worries at all. Like I was mentioning, so the federal government has been pushing housing authorities across the country. Actually, NYCHA in New York City have been somewhat later to doing this in New York City through the PACT program. And what the PACT program does is switch the funding from Section 9 to Section 8, but it involves a partnership with a private manager. So a private developer comes in, partners with NYCHA through a ground lease, which is an agreement to lease the management of the properties. And what that allows the manager to do, this new private entity to do, is to manage the properties, make the repairs using the additional resources that Section 8 provides. And really the reason that the federal government has done this is that the Section 8 program historically, and there's a variety of kind of reasons that we could talk more about if it's of interest, the Section 8 program has generally seen a greater amount of funding and more stable over time. And so, HUD pushing this program for housing authorities has really been a big priority for them, for the federal government. But one thing to note, and there are about 15,000 apartments in New York City that NYCHA has done through the PACT program, through brought in a private manager to make these repairs, conversion to Section 8 funding. And if you go to one of those developments, you'll see, that the repairs do get made. And, depending on folks' perspective, some residents are, really happy to have a different manager that isn't NYCHA. And some folks, are very skeptical or hesitant or even fearful around having a private manager. And so one of the things that we heard loud and clear from a number of folks around the city over the past few years is a desire for, yes, repairs are good. We want to make sure that we're addressing the capital needs that are so desperately needed that residents really, kind of must have as part of, upholding the lease and as part of being in compliance and providing a safe, good quality home. But is there a way to do that without a private manager and to keep the public workforce in place and keep, all of the public employees and really not involve private managers at all? And so that was the whole reason behind the Public Housing Preservation Trust and the genesis of the idea. So what the trust is a separate government agency created by the state of New York. It is a small agency with a 9-member publicly appointed board, just like NYCHA. It's has the same types of public employees as NYCHA, who are all civil service, and the board is a mix of appointees from the mayor and from NYCHA itself. And what the trust allows NYCHA to do is to access the Section 8 funding, just like with the PACT RAD program, but do it without a private manager, right? So the trust basically sits in instead of the private manager and still is able to get that additional funding, which NYCHA can't access right now as a public housing authority, but without any involvement of private manager, without that partnership with a private manager. So what the trust is then able to do is to use that Section 8 funding to issue bonds, which essentially is taking on debt. It's using the additional funds that the Section 8 funds provide, taking on debt to be able to do those capital repairs up front, and oversees all of the renovations at the properties, so the construction of doing this renovation work. And in doing so, like I was mentioning, without the involvement of a private partner. So NYCHA is owning, controlling, managing the properties, and there's no private manager involved, and nothing is being sold as part of this. NYCHA's workforce remains in place, right? So the trust is doing the renovations, but also partnering with the housing authority, with NYCHA, for NYCHA's workforce who currently are, at the properties managing, caretakers, maintenance workers, supers, so on, all remain in place, continuing to do the jobs that they do now, but with the renovations that we're able to do through the trust. And what the trust legislation does is embed the rights of Section 9 into the legislation itself that was passed by the state. And so, for those of you who are curious, we can also drop the link to the final version of the bill that was passed and what's now become law, which contains many of these pieces, including a list of many of these rights that we're mentioning here. And then the last thing really to mention for right now is that one complaint that we hear around the city is, even when NYCHA does have money, even when NYCHA does have the funding, there's really a pretty substantial struggle to find good contractors, right? To be able to perform the work up to high standards and to do good quality work. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but one of the main ones is that NYCHA is constrained in our procurement in terms of what types of vendors we can procure. We have to go with lowest responsive bid oftentimes, and when you go with lowest responsive bid, which is the methodology where you basically put out a solicitation and you have to go with the kind of lowest cost version of anything that meets the minimum criterias. You're not able to take into account other factors that might be really important, that you might think are maybe just as important as cost into account. So what the trust is empowered to do underneath this legislation is to do what's known as best value procurement, which allows us to take into account cost, but also other important factors as well, like do you meet your schedules on time? To what extent are you performing well on Section 3 requirements and opportunities for residents? How are you doing in terms of communication, in terms of the quality of your materials and the scope of work that's being provided, which is a really big change in terms of being able to improve the projects that are being done through this. So one of the big things that Courtney is going to walk us through in a minute is the thing that's on the far left side of this page, which is that for the first time, and this is in in the law itself, there's a requirement that no development can be put through this process, can be transferred to the trust, unless residents at that development vote to opt into it. That's a legal requirement, and nothing can occur at that development with the trust until that vote happens and residents affirmatively say, yes, we would like to do this. So that is the second piece, which we'll transition to in a second. And NYCHA had some requirements around putting out those rules around voting. But that's a really big thing to emphasize because it's different from the way that NYCHA has approached these issues in the past, as many of you may know. I did talk some about the tenancy rights, but just to call out 964 regulations, which govern many of the pieces around resident participation in the operations of the housing authority, including resident councils, district councils, citywide councils. All of the 964 requirements apply in full, and that's in the state legislation. And there are additional requirements around resident involvement in vendor selection, right? So being involved in selecting vendors at the development who are going to be doing this work through the best value procurement, and then also on the back end, right? So not just being involved in who is doing the work, but also the oversight of that work as well, because that is a big thing that we hear a lot about is we really can't just be focusing on selection. It needs to also be oversight of the work to make sure folks who are contracting, these contractors, are performing according to the promises and standards that were made. So just lastly, in sum, that the trust again is 9-member board. the board has 5 appointees by the NYCHA CEO, 4 by the mayor, for 9 total. Of those 9, 4 have to be residents. The way that the trust is able to actually perform these renovations is by taking on the additional funds from the project-based Section 8, issuing municipal bonds from those additional funds to raise the capital, do the work, mold, lead, heat, elevators, so on, at these NYCHA developments that are so desperately needed. It is through a lease agreement with NYCHA that all of this is able to be arranged, and through partnership with NYCHA for NYCHA to continue to manage the properties and again, keep management of these properties, all of the public employees currently in place, which is so critical for this model. And again, just lastly, developments can only be transferred to the trust if residents vote to opt in, which again is a requirement of the law. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to just walk us through the voting procedures piece of this and dive a little bit deeper.
Thanks, Andrew. And so like that last point that Andrew had mentioned, developments can only transfer to the trust if residents vote to opt in. So that's something that's very new for us and pretty exciting. So I'm going to just walk us through that process. With that, there were a couple different key dates that we needed to hit as part of the legislation. The first one being that we did have to come up with a set of draft voting procedures by October 14th, which of course has passed. And we did hit that goal on time. How we came to those draft procedures was an internal group made up of some NYCHA employees, mainly tenant leaders, different advocates, and we came together to create the draft. We then went to a public comment period. So we had 8 public meetings. That number might be incorrect. I'll have to double check, but we went through across the city, at least one in each borough, to elicit comments on what people thought about that draft. And then we took those comments back and we did create the final voting procedure, the final version, which I will go through, which we're going through today. And then just again, these procedures kind of dictate how residents will be able to vote for what modernization strategy their development would go through. So whether that be the trust, whether that be through PACT-RAD, or whether it be to reject both options and stay within the status quo. So when we were thinking about these voting procedures, we kind of thought about 3 different categories or buckets of information. So the first one on the left-hand side is engagement information. So some of these things included, how are we going to engage with residents? How many meetings are we having? What information is going to be shared in order to make sure that residents are well informed for the vote? The next category is voting period. So how are residents going to vote? How will we administer the vote? Things like that. And then the last one is certification of the vote. So how are we going to ensure that, the vote is free and fair and that we can properly certify the results? And we'll go into each kind of category in more detail in the next couple slides. But before we get to that, I think we have to think about, who is going to vote. So there's kind of 2 categories here. So the first one on the left is heads of household. So these are people who sign the lease. And it's important to note that they do have to be 18 years or older. So typically it's 1 person or 2. So they're the ones who are signing the lease. They can also be referred to as tenants of record. And the second category here on the right-hand side is permanent authorized residents. So if you're recorded on the household composition and you're also 18 years of age or older, you would be able to vote. So think, if you have a parent as the head of household and then also living with them as an 18-year-old child, then both of those people would be able to vote. And then on the right-hand side, on the far right, we have a couple different categories of who wouldn't be eligible. So again, any resident under the age of 18 would not be able to vote. Same with anyone who's not part of the household composition. So anyone who may have temporary permission or, visitors, if you have someone staying with you for the weekend, they would not be able to vote in this election. And then also employees, specifically employees who work at the development but may not live at the development, they are ineligible to vote. So jumping into the actual voting procedure itself, kind of like the meat and potatoes, the first category I had mentioned was engagement and information. So we thought long and hard about, again, how are we going to make sure that residents get the adequate information that they need to make an educated vote. And so the first one being that we really wanted to make sure that the TA leadership is involved in every step of the way. So as part of the voting procedures, we, being NYCHA, actually have to go to the TA leadership and come up kind of with like a mock plan, but we would consult with the TA in terms of what the best practices are for engagement. We really find that TA leadership, of course, they're really hands-on and on the ground. So, it's really helpful because they often know, what languages their development speaks or what days may be best for the meeting. And so we really want to make sure that we are collaborating with them before any kind of engagement happens. And then the next point here, as part of the engagement plan, it does have to be a minimum of 100 days per site. So before, or what kind of kicks off that 100-day engagement is a notice of vote. So some kind of notification that would include various pieces of information. So again, options on the ballot, which would be the trust, RAD Pact, or stay in Section 9. Dates and times of public meetings, the purpose of the vote, contact information, things like that. So that would kick off the 100-day engagement period. And as part of that plan, there are different kinds of, minimum requirements that we have to hit as part of that plan. So for example, there's specific outreach materials that we need to include, specific information on each of the options, residents' rights, construction standards, any timelines. And we also have minimum standards for how many meetings need to be a part of that engagement plan. So in the voting procedure itself, it does say that we have to have at least 4 meetings open to all residents at the development. But I do want to note that this is just a standard. Of course, I think in working with the TA, we would kind of edit that, add more meetings as we see fit, whatever it takes to make sure that we're getting the correct information in a timely manner to residents at the site.
Courtney, really quick, just to, I see a couple hands, or I've seen a couple hands. We'll handle questions at the end of the presentation. You can keep your hand up or not, but we'll handle questions at the end. Thanks.
Thanks. So going into the second category of voting period, we do want to make sure that tenants are able to vote in as many ways as possible. And so the internal group made up of resident leaders and advocates. We figured in person, so you're very traditional going into a specific polling site and voting, as well as online and by mail. We do want to make sure that we're using all 3, again, just to make sure that the voting is as accessible as possible. In terms of timing, kind of going, again, trying to make this as accessible as possible, we do want to make sure that we allow ample time. So in the final voting procedures, it is a 30-day voting period, with online and by mail being for all 30 days and in person for the last 10 days of that 30-day period. Again, it's calendar days. So just want to make note of that. We're not talking about, business days here. It would be the full calendar days. And that 30-day voting period is actually at the tail end at the very end following the 100-day engagement period. So it does not take up any of that time. We would engage for the full 100 days, and then it moves on to the voting period. And then this final box here, the selection criteria for modernization strategies. So in order, again, like we've kind of been mentioning, in order for a development to move forward with any of the modernization strategies, they do have to opt in, but this kind of dictates, which option would get it after the vote. So this would be by the most votes. So not ranked choice voting, but by which option receives the most votes here. And then this last category here, which was certification. So again, this is both in the state legislation, but also in the final voting rule. So residents, if they are voting, they do have the option to reject both the trust and pact and remain in Section 9. That is an option, should they see that's the best route there. The second point here in terms of minimum percentage. So again, something in the state legislation that said we did have to come up with some kind of percentage or minimum threshold percentage. In the legislation, it doesn't have a specific number necessarily, but that was something that we had to come up after the legislation was passed. I do want to note that in the draft, it was at 10%, but we actually doubled this number. I also want to note that this is not necessarily a goal, right? Of course, we do want to make sure that we are reaching every household and we are getting as many votes as possible, but this minimum threshold really is to show what would be considered a valid vote in order to certify the vote. So again, not a goal. Of course, we think that we will exceed it and we certainly want to, but that is the minimum threshold as according to the final procedures. And then last but not least, for this presentation, in order to make sure that we do have a free and fair vote, we will have a third-party administrator. This is something that I think we can all agree on, and something that was really well supported across this whole entire process is that we have a third party. So they would conduct the elections and the certification. So they would tally the votes, they would handle all of the ballots, and then they would certify once that voting period closes. So just want to really nail home that it would not be NYCHA. It's a third party administrator. So this timeline kind of puts it all together, kind of in a digestible format. So off to the left again, we would start with that initial engagement with the tenant association. We would develop that voter outreach plan with them. Again, we would discuss how many meetings, how long the engagement past the 100 days, etc. Following that, we would release the notice of vote, which starts that at a minimum 100-day engagement period with the various minimum standards, again, such as the 4 meetings and the various forms of communications. Again, that is a minimum, and we would certainly look to increase that according to what the tenant association thinks. After that 100-day period, we would then move on to the voting period, which is 30 days. The 20 days, the first 20 days being only online and by mail voting, and those last days being all 3 options. So those last 10 days, all 3 online, by mail, and in person. And following that period, we would then work with the third-party election administrator, and they would count the votes, investigate any challenges that people may raise, etc. So this is a lot of information, which I think is something that we get quite a bit, but we are happy to answer any questions that you may have or any clarifications that you may need.
Kenyelle, go ahead.
Thank you. So an article came out in the Village Sun that the sewer park extension agreed to go private. Many residents said that no residents received notice of a vote. They just received notice that they were going private. The article also stated that although the repairs were done, in previous developments that went private, there was like a gap So right now, we see a lot of a gap with our management, right? So, but at least we have a management to go to. They're saying they're leaving like there's a gap with no one to talk to, no one to make complaints to. How can we secure that from not happening with this, privatization?
Hi, Danielle. So just a few things, because I think there are a few questions in that. On Seward Park, so there are a number of, I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, but there are a number of developments that have converted to packed RAD already. And then there are also a number of developments that are in engagement for packed RAD that are not actually converted yet, but have been in the process of going through it, right? Because it takes a long time for that to happen. Usually it's about 1.5 years to 2 years, depending on the specific instance. And I can double check with the team that oversees PACT, but I believe Seward Park is in engagement, which is still
Okay.
going through without a vote, because it's already in that pipeline, which what preceded all of this. So that's probably what's going on at Seward Park extension specifically. But if there are further questions on that, I think I'd be happy to take that back to the team that works on packed RAD, just because I don't know the ins and outs of the latest there. On your second question around the gap, I assume you're talking about in terms of work just not being performed up to the standard.
Like complaints, holding management, landlord accountable for repairs. We already deal with that now with NYCHA. Would it become worse?
I certainly would hope not. I would certainly hope that it improves.
That's the reports being, from people who already went private.
I will say, there are a lot of developments that have gone through packed, and I think we would certainly be happy to, if it's of interest for you or for anyone, to go on a tour or be connected with residents at any of those developments. We'd certainly be happy to arrange that. And if there are specific instances that you have in mind, or folks, specific cases, I think we definitely want to look into that as well. NYCHA retains oversight over all of this, and we're still involved, and in fact, end up in some instances having to make sure that work is being performed correctly. And so if there's specific complaints that you have in mind, please send that my way. If you want to share it privately after that, that's also totally fine. And we'd be happy to look into that further, because that shouldn't be the case.
Thank you. One more question. So in the event that the development votes to reject both and stay Section 9,
Mhm.
does that development now have more money for repairs, since a large majority of NYCHA developments may be transitioning into private? Or does it mean we get less money for the people who stay Section 9?
So it should be the same, because it's proportional. And if a development switches from Section 9 funding to Section 8 funding, what that means is that generally, proportionally, the funding that used to go to that development will switch to the Section 8 side. And so for developments that choose to remain Section 9, there shouldn't be a difference in the funding levels, that it should be the same as before. The one caveat that I will say is that all of that is dependent on the federal, state, and local government's level of funding. So next year, if the federal government said, we're going to increase the amount of funding that we provide to Section 9 developments, then that would mean that Section 9 developments across the board would get more funding. If they said that we're going to decrease the amount of funding, then there would be less. So it really is less about the conversions that are happening and more about the level of funding that the federal, state, and local governments are providing.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Trevor, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Just one quick question. If the development does not reach the 20% minimum threshold, which you had said was 10% before, what happens? Does the whole process start again? Is it over? Do you revote?
So it would fail. I think, ideally this never happens, but obviously it could. If it does, that's a conversation with the local resident leadership, the TA at that development, about whether it's in everyone's best interest to do another vote, or whether it's not something that we should pursue. The rules don't specify that it has to be redone within a certain amount of time, or it has to be redone at all. It just says, just like the law outlines that nothing would go forward, it would fail. But I think in reality and practice, that would have to be a conversation with the community and with the residents.
Okay, thank you.
Damaris, go ahead.
Hi, this is Damaris Reyes. Thank you for your presentation, and I hope that you can share your slideshow with us. I mean, usually at the committee level, when presentations are made, they share the slideshow, so it would be great for reference. But really, it's not a question that I have. I just want to encourage NYCHA in the spirit of moving forward with the trust and the new voting procedures, and also highlighting and supporting what Kenyelle said about the Sewer Park extension, and how many of the residents there are unclear about the fact that RAD is coming and don't feel that they've had a voice. And I know that you said that the beginning of the engagement process is happening, but I think it would behoove NYCHA to lead by example, and to show how this process could work by having it at Sewer Park and allowing the residents there to fully vote on whether or not they want RAD. These decisions were just recently made. It's not like, RAD was decided on 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and there's already work happening. I think there's still time to do that, and I would like to encourage NYCHA to take that route instead. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Damaris. And we will absolutely share the presentation. I guess, Jake, if I'll send it to you, or Susan, whoever we can send it to.
Andrew, if you send it to me, I'll send it to the committee. Thank you.
And if I could just say one last thing.
You could include the office when you send it, please.
Great, thank you. If I could just say one last thing, and if it's necessary, and if NYCHA, needs to see the evidence, we would be happy to go into Sewer Park to be able to convey to you and collect feedback from many residents to show you the need for engaging in a different process. So that's just something I'm putting on the table. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, Alistair, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Andrew, for the presentation. Quick question. The first slide you showed that had budgets of 40 billion plus, how many apartments does that cover? I'm trying to figure out the cost per apartment.
Yeah, so we have roughly about 175,000 apartments. We that number has the breakdown of how many are Section 9 versus conventionally, like I was mentioning, conventionally funded Section 9 versus PACT RAD changes as developments go through the process. So that's why that number sometimes shifts. But we have let me see if I can actually find, while we're on the call, a fact sheet that kind of breaks down all of our different figures.
Just as a back of envelope number comes out to about $230,000 of capital improvement per apartment.
Correct.
That's correct. It's a big number.
It is. And I will say, for those of you familiar with the construction industry or just this work more generally, you might be aware that over the past I'd say maybe year and a half, 2 years, there's been a significant increase in costs around construction work. And that's not just New York City, it's not just NYCHA, it's really everywhere. And so that's been a challenge, not just for housing authorities like NYCHA, but anyone who's doing construction, whether it's new construction or renovating buildings.
Thanks, Andrew.
Steve, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to ask if the engagement and voting process will be conducted in multiple languages, in terms of the outreach material. Will it be in English, Spanish, Chinese, and other languages, depending on the population of those buildings, and, flyers, pamphlets, and also, will meetings be conducted in multiple language with translators, and will the ballots also be available in different languages?
So yes to all of that. And in the procedures themselves, there's a section on language access. NYCHA and I believe it's actually not just NYCHA, it's city more broadly. The requirements are for a minimum number of languages. I believe it's 5. And then there's specific call out in the language access section for there to be procedures around those who might fall out of the most commonly spoken languages, right? So, at many of our developments, there's obviously a lot of different languages spoken. And so, making sure that there's a procedure for that if it's not, one of the ones that's more common.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Do any other members of the committee have questions? All right. Aixa, please go ahead.
Give me a minute. Good evening, everyone. As everyone knows, including NYCHA and the staff that's here on board, I am totally against the trust. One of the other side of this trust is that we don't, you're allowing our properties to be mortgaged. Community Board 3 has the most expensive property in all of NYCHA. And there are no guarantees that if the mortgage collapses, that we will have that it would be bailed out. Given NYCHA's history of mismanaging funds and hiring lousy contractors, why would we go to the trust? And the other piece of this presentation that I'm a little bit about is 2 things. The residents leadership asked for no less than 68% of the population in each individual, and NYCHA chose 20%. Fine. And the other thing is we have no guarantees on the process that's being handled. And I have a real issue with this presentation being presented. It looks really pretty and everything else, but the reality of it is that the residents have not been listened to. We have not been respected, and this does not work. So I just and you do not mention resident management, which is what a lot of the resident leadership are asking about. Why don't you talk about resident leadership and explain to this community board what that is? Thank you.
So on that last point, resident management corporations and Ms. Torres, I can certainly talk a little bit about that. And if there's more that you want me to talk about, I'm happy to do that as well. So resident management corporations, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with them, are guaranteed under Part 964, which is the part of the regulations that I was mentioning earlier, and actually gives residents the option to manage part or all of the operations of a property themselves. So it'd actually be a partnership where residents form an entity and then, negotiate with the housing authority, NYCHA, in this case, to do part of, either it could be repairs or maintenance or what have you, or all of the operations of a facility. And it's something that has been done in other parts of the country, certainly, and there's been success in other parts of the country with resident management corporations. One thing to just note about resident management corporations is that they are an option that's available right now under Section 9, obviously. So, Part 964, which is, governs all of the Section 9 pieces, provides that path for resident management corporations currently, and part of the trust legislation is calling out resident management corporations as well, and not only because 964 has been fully transferred over, but specifically obligating the trust to negotiate with any residents who want to do resident management at their sites if they were to go through the trust. So while it's not on the voting procedures themselves, and yes, I apologize for not mentioning as part of the presentation, it is in the legislation itself and called out as kind of a subclause, in addition to just being an option available under Section 9 right now for those who want to explore it.
Thank you. And Caitlin, go ahead.
Hi, this is Caitlin. I'm from Councilmember Christopher Merte's office. We've been working a lot with the residents at Seward Park as they're kind of being rushed and forced through this process. We share a lot of the concerns that Aitza brought up. And frankly, we've had NYCHA lie to our office, block us from meetings we were meant to have access to, not tell us that resident engagement meetings were even happening. Residents have experienced personal threats from NYCHA, from other individuals who are supporting the PACT plan, and things are just really chaotic, unprofessional, and out of hand. So I just wanted to share that perspective and experience with the people on this call, that even though it can look like a great presentation, that fully funding public housing, is the proper policy solution to what's going on in NYCHA. And as Danielle pointed out before, there's actually a lot of issues when it's handed over to private management. In our engagement with Seward Park residents, it's been really clear that a vast majority of them are opposed. And I know that they'll be presenting physical evidence of this to NYCHA soon. And so I hope that the voting process, if we ever get there, actually is much more transparent than we've seen anything NYCHA do so far in this process, and it's just conducted properly. And we're happy to work with anyone or provide any more information to people on this call who might feel like what's been presented tonight, is a little bit misleading. Thank you.
So if I could just respond to that.
Andrew, would you mind clarifying? My understanding is that Seward Park Extension was going through PACT.
That's correct. Yeah, so that's what I want.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to be very clear. So there are two separate programs that we are talking about tonight. They're related, but two separate programs. They're related in that they both involve Section 8 funding. One is the PACT RAD program, and that predates the trust. That's been going on for some time now. And many developments, like I mentioned, have already either converted through this or are in the process of going through it. And that is the situation, I believe, at Seward Park Extension. So none of the voting procedure timeline or any of that we just talked through would be applicable for those because they're already in the process. The second program is the Public Housing Preservation Trust, and that does not involve a private manager. There's no privatization in terms of management, in terms of land sale, in terms of anything involved with the trust. And the trust voting procedures, which is what we talked about tonight, have not gone into effect yet. They have not, we just finalized the voting rules, and all of this, there's a lot more to come later this year. So there's just two very different programs. And in terms of your specific concerns, I'm really sorry to hear about that experience. And we're happy to follow up with our intergovernmental team on that. I haven't been personally involved in any of those conversations, but if you would like, we can certainly follow up on that and have further conversations. But again, just two different programs. I want to be very clear about that.
Great. Does anyone have any final questions? Well, I think that's it. Andrew, Courtney, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for giving this presentation. This was tremendously informative. And I know we are all very grateful that you came to present this to us. And that
Thanks so much for having us. And if anyone, I will actually just drop I think many of you may have this, but I will just drop my email address into the chat in case anyone has any questions that come to them afterwards.
Point of information. Is the community board have all this information available that some of us who didn't go from the beginning could read upon?
What information are you talking about, Herman? Do you mean the
All
PowerPoint?
the presentation that was made beside the PowerPoint, is it on hard copy somewhere or somewhere we could download it?
The video will be online tomorrow, and NYCHA is also going to send us the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Susan.
I do have a question. Is that okay, Jake? Go.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. We'll take one more question.
Yeah, but it's not for the other part. It's not for him, but it's for you, Jade. I just need you.
Oh, no. Well, if it's not on the agenda, why don't we get in touch after the meeting? How does that sound?
Yes, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Do that. Well, let's get in touch after we've adjourned. How's that? Okay. Well, that was our last agenda item. So let's take a final vote and then we can adjourn for next month. Megan, would you mind calling the final vote?
Final vote. Jake Gold,
Yes.
Alistair Economakis,
Yes.
Andrea Gordillo,
Yes.
Herman Hewitt,
Yes.
Trevor Holland,
Yes.
Damaris Reyes, Sandra.
Forgive
Scruggs.
me, but I'm a little confused as to what we're voting on. I apologize. I stepped away for 2 seconds.
This is just the last vote of the
It's the adjournment.
of the meeting. the
Oh, just
adjournment.
voting to adjourn?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Sandra
Yes.
Strother,
Yes, yeah.
Jackie Wong, Dominic Berg, Ariadna Chua,
Yes.
Steve Herrick,
Yes.
Megan Joy, yes.
All right. And I've actually never adjourned a meeting before. Do I need to hear a motion to adjourn?
I think you just voted to adjourn.
Yeah.
Oh, we just voted to adjourn. Okay,
Well,
well,
you
I
should
didn't
have
hear a
done that
motion to
before.
adjourn.